In June of 1942, Japan was a god upon the sea. For 6 months, the rising sun had devoured everything before it: Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines. The Imperial Navy stretched from the Indian Ocean to the edges of Hawaii, an empire of carriers and steel. To the rest of the world, Japan looked unstoppable. In Tokyo's Naval General Staff, the air smelled of ink and tobacco. Maps covered the tables, arrows, grids, tiny flags marking victories. Officers stood in silence, heads bent, while a single fan turned lazily overhead. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, tapped his pipe against an ashtray and said quietly, "The Americans are children. They have courage but no strategy. Their fleet is crippled. Now, we end it." He pointed toward a speck in the middle of the Pacific. Midway Atoll. 2 small islands surrounded by coral, barely visible even on a clear day. "That," he said, "is where the remnants of their navy will die." The plan was perfection on paper. 4 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, would strike Midway from the northwest. A smaller decoy fleet would head north toward the Aleutians to draw away American reinforcements. Then the main force would crush whatever remained of Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet. They called it Operation Imai. The officers bowed deeply. Victory, they believed, was inevitable. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly on the windows of the Imperial headquarters. Inside, a sense of divine destiny filled the room. For months, Japan had rewritten the laws of war. They had humiliated the West, conquered colonies that had stood for centuries. To them, the Pacific was a Japanese lake. The emperor's portrait hung above the doorway, and beneath it, Yamamoto paused before leaving. "Once we take Midway," he murmured, "they will beg for peace." No one questioned him. No one dared. Across the ocean, in Pearl Harbor, American docks still reeked of oil and death. The skeletons of battleships lay beneath the surface, their guns pointing uselessly toward the sky. Yet behind closed doors, something else was happening, quiet, patient, invisible. While Japan built ships, America built silence, codebreakers, spies, and listening stations. But Yamamoto didn't know that. Not yet. In early May, reconnaissance planes reported no sign of resistance. The ocean between Japan and Midway looked calm, almost too calm. The crews joked that even the sea bowed before the emperor. Pilots boasted of the coming triumph. "We will erase their last island in one morning," one lieutenant wrote in his diary. There was laughter in the mess hall that night, sake poured over polished tables. One officer leaned over and said, "When this is over, we'll drink on the shores of Hawaii." Another replied, "And then San Francisco." The laughter was easy, full of certainty. Out at sea, the carriers moved through the dark like vast cities. The flight decks shimmered under lantern light, mechanics tuning engines that purred like predators. The sailors called the carriers floating temples, each one a shrine to the emperor. They believed no wave, no bomb, no god could touch them. But beneath that confidence, tiny cracks began to form, unseen, unheard. The fleet's radio messages, sent in the supposedly unbreakable JN-25 code, echoed across the Pacific. Every message, every bearing, every weather report. Each one captured and quietly deciphered by a handful of American cryptographers working in a basement in Honolulu. The men of Japan didn't know. They couldn't. For them, fate still wore a uniform. The first week of June arrived with perfect weather. Yamamoto's flagship, Yamato, sailed behind the main carriers like a mountain of steel. Its guns could hurl shells 20 miles. Its radar, primitive but powerful, swept the horizon. Officers paced the decks, waiting for word that Midway's airfields had been erased. "Remember," Yamamoto said to his staff as they prepared to launch the strike, "the enemy is blind. We control the sky, the sea, and the gods themselves." In Tokyo, newspapers already printed drafts of victory headlines. "The Americans routed at Midway. The Pacific secured for 1,000 years. Radio Tokyo rehearsed its bulletins. Even the Imperial Palace had prepared a message of thanks for the Navy. Every man aboard those ships believed the same thing: Japan could not be defeated. But the ocean doesn't care about plans. It listens, it waits, and it remembers. And far across that same ocean, inside a dim room filled with typewriters and cigarette smoke, a young American analyst looked up from a decrypted message and whispered to his colleague, "They're coming for Midway." The other man frowned. "You're sure?" He nodded slowly. "I'd bet the war on it." At that same moment, in the dark waters north of the Pacific, Yamamoto's fleet steamed forward, unaware that its every move, every radio signal, every line of attack, had already been heard. For Japan, Midway would be the final proof of divine destiny. For America, it would be the first sign that gods can bleed. And neither side knew that within 3 days, four giant carriers would be burning on the surface of the Pacific, and thousands of men would sink with them. They called it the turning point. But for the men who lived it, it was something stranger: 5 minutes when history itself stopped breathing. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The ceiling fans turned lazily above the cramped room at Station HYPO, Pearl Harbor's code-breaking center. The air smelled of stale coffee, sweat, and cigarette smoke. Rows of typewriters clattered, each keystroke another attempt to pull a secret from the static of war. Chief cryptanalyst Joseph Rockefort sat hunched over a desk cluttered with half-burned cigarettes and yellow notepads. He wore his bathrobe, he practically lived in it now, and stared at a string of meaningless letters. AF reports shortage of fresh water. AF, he murmured. Always AF. For months, they had intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Coded messages, all pointing toward an operation at a place the Japanese called simply AF. No one knew what it meant. Some believed it referred to the Aleutians. Others said it might be Fiji, or even Hawaii itself. Rockefort didn't guess. He listened. He read the rhythm between the lines. AF is Midway, he told his team finally. It has to be. The others exchanged uncertain glances. To prove it, Rockefort crafted a trap. Midway was ordered to send an unencrypted message claiming that its desalination plant had broken down. The message went out quietly on May 20th, carried on the Pacific wind like bait. 2 days later, a Japanese transmission crackled through the static. AF reports shortage of fresh water. Rockefort stood from his chair, a tired smile forming under his dark eyes. "Gentlemen," he said, "they're coming for Midway." In Washington, few believed him. Admiral Ernest King demanded confirmation. Even Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, hesitated. The memory of Pearl Harbor still haunted every decision. But the logic was unbreakable. The Japanese fleet was on the move, and now, for the first time, the Americans knew exactly where. By the end of May, Pearl Harbor buzzed with a strange energy, half fear, half anticipation. On the walls of Nimitz's office hung a massive map of the Pacific, a red thread stretching from Japan to the heart of the ocean. Tiny markers represented the Japanese carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Rockefort's men had traced every step. Outside, the rain drummed against the windows. Inside, the hum of machines filled the night. Operators with headphones transcribed bursts of Morse code, then handed the slips of paper down a chain of desks until they reached Rockefort's table. Each note was another heartbeat of the approaching storm. At 2:17 a.m., an operator whispered, "Message from Tokyo, fleet moving east." Rockefort looked up. "Send it to Nimitz. Now." Hours later, in the war room of Pearl Harbor, Nimitz drew a slow line across the chart with his pencil. "We'll meet them here," he said, tapping the waters north of Midway. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown. "It's not much, but it'll have to do." A young lieutenant swallowed hard. "Sir, if we're wrong." Nimitz interrupted quietly. "Then we lose the Pacific." Meanwhile, halfway across the ocean, Japanese intelligence officers congratulated themselves on perfect secrecy. Their code JN-25, they believed, was unbreakable. They didn't know that every letter they sent was already a nail in their own coffin. Back in the basement, Rockefort leaned back in his chair, exhausted but wired. "We've cracked the gods," he muttered. One of his assistants laughed nervously. "Then let's hope they don't notice." The tension in those final days of May was electric. The American fleet steamed out under radio silence. Crews painted over ship names, removed identifying flags, and cut the lights at night. Even the men aboard didn't know exactly where they were headed. On Midway itself, Marines dug trenches and camouflaged the airfield. They worked by moonlight, their faces streaked with oil and salt. "They'll come from the northwest," one officer said, "and when they do, we hit them with everything we've got." The island smelled of fuel and fear. Seagulls wheeled above the surf, unaware that within days, this tiny scrap of coral would become the center of the world. Rockefort's final decrypt came through on June 1. The Japanese fleet had departed Sasebo, bound directly for Midway. He sent a single message to Nimitz. "They will strike between June 4 and June 5. All 4 carriers confirmed. No one in that dark room spoke for a moment. The only sound was the whir of the ceiling fan and the faint echo of rain. Rockefort took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and whispered, "Now we wait." 3,000 miles away, in the calm of the western Pacific, Yamamoto's fleet moved forward beneath a spotless sky. Officers stood on deck, unaware that their perfect plan was already in enemy hands. The gods of war had drawn their swords, and the Americans were waiting with theirs unsheathed. As night fell over Midway, the island went black. Engines were checked one last time, bombs armed, maps studied by the flicker of lanterns. Pilots slept in their flight suits, listening to the distant murmur of the sea. Somewhere out there, invisible in the dark, the greatest armada Japan had ever assembled was closing in. Rockefort left his office that night and stepped out into the humid Hawaiian air. He looked up at the stars, clear, silent, endless. "We've given them the chance," he said quietly. "Now it's up to the men out there." He turned and walked back inside. The typewriters had gone quiet. Only the radio still whispered, faint and steady, carrying fragments of the future through the static. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. And by dawn on June 4, the ocean would erupt. The morning of June 4, 1942, rose from the sea like a curtain of fire. At 4:30 a.m., the first Japanese squadrons thundered into the sky from 4 colossal carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Their engines shook the decks, and the sailors below cheered as each plane disappeared into the golden dawn. To them, this was another Pearl Harbor. On the island of Midway, radar operators caught the first blip at 5:20 a.m. "Enemy aircraft approaching, bearing 320, one of them said. His voice barely trembled. The message flashed to Pearl Harbor, "They're here." Then came the hum. Like distant bees, the sound grew until it filled the air, a storm of wings and metal. Bombs fell across Midway in waves, hangars exploded, fuel tanks burst into orange clouds, runways cracked apart. Marines fired at the sky until their guns melted. From the command bunker, Major Floyd Parks watched the island burn. "They've gutted us," someone whispered. Parks shook his head. "No. They've woken us." American bombers scrambled from what was left of the airfield, many never returning. The sky above Midway turned into chaos, smoke, trails of fire, and black specks spiraling into the sea. Miles away, aboard the carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo received his first report, Midway airfield heavily damaged. Further attack recommended. He nodded, satisfied. Then another officer hurried in, face pale. "Admiral," he said. "Enemy ships sighted, bearing northeast." Nagumo froze. His planes were still en route, loaded for a second strike on the island. If he wanted to hit the American fleet, he would have to recall them and rearm. He hesitated. Every second mattered. Recover aircraft, he ordered. Rearm for ship attack. Below deck, chaos erupted. Bombs were hauled back to storage, torpedoes rolled out, fuel hoses snaked across the hangars. The carriers became floating powder kegs. One spark, one mistake, disaster. And then came the silence before the storm. Unseen to the Japanese, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, waited northeast of Midway. Their flight decks glistened under the sun as pilots climbed into their cockpits. Some still smelled of the coffee they'd barely finished. "Remember," said Commander Wade McCluskey aboard Enterprise, "we may not come back. But if we do our job right, the war turns today." At 7:10 a.m., the first wave of American torpedo bombers lifted off. They flew low over the sea, slow and exposed. Most of the pilots were barely 20. Above them, Japanese Zero fighters circled like hawks. The Devastator squadrons from Hornet and Yorktown attacked first, and were slaughtered. One after another, their planes caught fire and plunged into the water. Out of 41 torpedo bombers, 35 were destroyed. From the deck of Akagi, Japanese sailors cheered. The sky seemed theirs again. Nagumo allowed himself a smile. "The gods still favor Japan," he said quietly. But up above, far beyond the range of his lookouts, a different storm was forming. Commander McCluskey, searching desperately for the enemy, had flown off course. His fuel was running low when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding north, its wake cutting through the sea. McCluskey made a decision. "Follow it," he told his men. The destroyer was racing to rejoin the main fleet. Within minutes, McCluskey's squadrons saw them, 4 Japanese carriers, steaming in perfect formation, their decks crowded with rearming aircraft and open fuel lines. It was 10:20 a.m. The moment history pivoted. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio, "We've got them. Attack. Attack now." The dauntless dive bombers peeled from the sky like falling stars. Pilots screamed into their microphones as they aimed for the heart of the enemy. The first bomb struck Kaga amidships, erupting in fire that tore through the hangar decks. Seconds later, Akagi was hit. A single 1,000-pound bomb plunged through her flight deck, detonating among armed planes. Fire spread faster than men could run. Aviators, mechanics, officers, all consumed in seconds. The sea boiled with flame. One Japanese pilot, trapped in the inferno, managed to radio, "Tell my wife I saw the sun twice today." Then his signal vanished. From miles away, the sailors on Enterprise watched the columns of black smoke rise into the blue. The impossible had happened. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning. Admiral Yamamoto, still hundreds of miles behind the main fleet, received the first report at 10:45. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "So the gods have abandoned us." By noon, Hiryu, the last carrier, launched its counterstrike, determined to avenge the others. But by then, the tide had turned. The men on both sides didn't yet know it, but the empire that once ruled the Pacific had just begun to die. The ocean hissed, swallowing the smoke, the bodies, and the last echoes of Japanese invincibility. And above it all, the sound of engines still thundered, because one ship remained to fight back. They looked up, and saw the sun falling on them. But it wasn't the sun. It was a squadron of American dive bombers, screaming out of the clouds. At 10:20 a.m., the Pacific sky tore open. From the cover of scattered clouds, 3 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown broke formation and began their descent. Below them, 4 Japanese carriers lay exposed, decks crammed with planes being refueled, bombs stacked and waiting, fuel lines coiled like snakes. The sea around them shimmered calm and blue. Commander Clarence McCluskey, flying lead, saw the massive shapes beneath him. His fuel gauge was near empty. He pressed the radio switch and shouted one word that cut through the static. "Dive! Dive! Dive!" The Dauntless tipped forward as one. The wind screamed through their wings. Pilots clenched their teeth, holding their planes steady as the altimeter spun downward, 10,000 feet. 6000. 3000. From the deck of Kaga, a Japanese sailor raised his head and blinked against the glare. He saw glittering dots falling from the sky. For half a second, he thought they were birds. Then the first bomb struck. A blinding flash split the carrier in two. Flames erupted across the deck, swallowing men and aircraft. A second bomb plunged through the forward elevator and detonated in the hangar, igniting rows of fuel tanks. The ship became a furnace. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo felt the shock wave roll across the sea. "Where did they come from?" he shouted. But it was already too late. A Dauntless from Enterprise, piloted by Lieutenant Dick Best, dove straight for the center of the flagship. His bomb struck just behind the flight deck's midsection. It pierced through to the hangar, where armed planes sat waiting. The explosion tore through the ship like a heartbeat. In seconds, Akagi, the pride of the Japanese Navy, was engulfed. Flames shot 100 feet into the air. Fuel poured into the sea, burning across the water's surface. Then came Soryu. 3 direct hits ripped through her decks. A column of smoke rose higher than her mast, blackening the sun. Men leapt overboard, uniforms aflame. From above, one American gunner whispered into his radio, "God, we hit them all." 5 minutes. That's all it took. 5 minutes to erase 20 years of Japanese naval dominance. Inside the chaos, order collapsed. Radio calls turned into screams. Fire on every deck. Steering is gone. Abandoned ship. The once invincible fleet, Japan's pride, its proof of divine favor, was burning in front of its own men. Officers threw themselves into the sea rather than face capture. Pilots who hadn't yet taken off sat trapped inside their cockpits, surrounded by smoke. One of them, choking on fumes, pressed his hands together and whispered, "Forgive me, Emperor." McCluskey's Dauntless pulled out of their dives, engines straining as heat licked their wings. Behind them, the Pacific shimmered red. Over the radio, another pilot's voice cracked, "We did it, Skipper. We really did it." On the Enterprise, sailors crowded the railings, watching the smoke pillars rise like black mountains. Some cheered. Others just stared, silent, knowing they had witnessed something the world would never see again. Admiral Chester Nimitz, far away in Pearl Harbor, received the first coded message. 3 carriers burning. Enemy fleet in retreat. He read it twice, then placed it face down on his desk. "So it begins," he murmured. But aboard the last Japanese carrier, Hiryu, there was no surrender. Its captain, Tomio Kaku, stood amid the smoke of distant fires and said, "3 are gone. Then we will be their vengeance." On his order, mechanics began arming torpedoes. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, faces expressionless. There was no music, no speeches, only the sound of tools clanking against steel. From the bridge, a young ensign whispered, "Sir, the others are finished." Kaku replied, "Then the honor is ours." As Hiryu's engines roared to life, the carrier turned into the wind. Smoke from the dying ships drifted across the horizon, blotting out the sun. Through it, the last squadron of Japanese bombers rose slowly, their shadows stretching over the waves. Below them, the ocean still burned where Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were dying. The flames hissed as they met the water, like gods whispering their last breath. 5 minutes had destroyed an empire. But one shadow still lived. Far to the north, the Enterprise's radar picked up a faint signal. More planes, fast, direct, flying straight toward them. Aboard the American carrier, the klaxon sounded again. Men ran for battle stations. Someone yelled, "Incoming!" The victory cheers died instantly. Because from the smoke of defeat, Hiryu was coming. By noon, the Pacific was a graveyard of fire. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were burning wrecks. Only Hiryu still moved, cutting through the haze like a wounded animal refusing to die. On her deck, there was no ceremony, no speeches, just the sound of boots, wrenches, and shouted orders. Prepare for takeoff. First wave ready. Captain Tomio Kaku barked. His face was blackened with smoke, but his voice was steady. The men obeyed without looking toward the rising pillars of smoke to the south. Their comrades were gone. Honor demanded vengeance. At 12 o'clock, Hiryu's first strike group, 18 dive bombers escorted by Zeros, rose into the air. Their shadows slipped across the water like ghosts. On the USS Yorktown, sailors were still celebrating the morning's victory when the alarm screamed through the ship. Enemy planes inbound. Bearing 315. The cheers vanished. Crews ran to battle stations. Gunners swung turrets, loaders slammed shells into breeches, and one young sailor muttered, "Not again." At 12:20, the Japanese appeared, small black dots against the sun. "Here they come," someone yelled. The first bomb struck near the island structure, throwing men into the air. The second exploded forward, shattering the flight deck. The third hit dead center, turning the carrier into a furnace. Smoke poured into the sky. The sea boiled with oil. Yet amid the chaos, the crew of Yorktown fought back. Fire crews dragged hoses across burning steel, engineers kept the generators alive. After an hour, the flames weakened. "She's still afloat," an officer shouted. Men cheered, exhausted, filthy, half-deaf. But on Hiryu, Captain Kaku was unmoved. "Report. Enemy carrier damaged, possibly sinking," came the reply. Kaku turned to his air boss. "We finish it. Prepare the second wave." At 1400 hours, the torpedo bombers lifted off. The deck crew saluted as they vanished into the smoke. Many knew they would not return. They found Yorktown at 1430, wounded but alive, smoke trailing like a flag. The American fighters met them head-on, wild, desperate, brave, but the Japanese pressed through. 2 torpedoes struck the port side in quick succession. The ship groaned. Metal screamed. Then she listed sharply, water pouring through the hull. "Abandon ship," came the order. Some wept as they jumped. Others saluted the flag one last time before diving into the burning sea. Yorktown slowly rolled, her great deck disappearing beneath the waves. Aboard Hiryu, a cheer rose. "One for 3, the gunner shouted. For a brief moment, the men smiled. They had avenged their fleet. But their victory lasted less than 2 hours. At 1630, American scouts from Enterprise spotted Hiryu through the smoke. Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Dick Best led the dive bombers in. "That's her," McCluskey said. "Let's end it." The sky filled with the scream of dauntless engines. From Hiryu's bridge, a lookout shouted, "Dive bombers." The first bomb hit near the forward elevator, tearing a hole through the deck. The second exploded aft, igniting fueled aircraft. The third struck near the island, blasting the bridge in fire. The explosions joined into one rolling roar. Flames leapt high, wrapping the carrier in orange light. On board, sailors tried to fight the inferno, hauling hoses through smoke thick as oil. "Close the hatch," someone yelled. "Not until they're out." Another answered, and the fire took them both. By 1700 hours, Hiryu was lost. Her engines died, her flight deck collapsing in sheets of molten steel. Captain Kaku gave the final order, "Abandon ship." His men saluted and went over the side. Some sang softly as they floated away. As night fell, the last Japanese carrier at Midway drifted alone, burning. The sea hissed as flames reached the waterline. From miles away, sailors aboard Enterprise watched the glow fade. No one cheered. The victory felt too heavy to celebrate. A radioman whispered, "We've killed their last giant." Another answered, "Giants don't die easy." By dawn, Hiryu was gone, scuttled by torpedoes from her own escorts. Only oil and debris marked the spot where she had stood against fate. In one day, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 248 planes, and over 3,000 men. But the ocean was not silent. It rolled on, endless and indifferent, as if to remind both sides that even empires are small upon its surface. For the Americans, it was victory. For the Japanese, a wound that would never heal. And for the world, Midway had become a line across history, before and after, glory and ruin, gods and men. When dawn broke over the Pacific on June 5, 1942, the horizon was empty. No Japanese carriers, no rising banners, only smoke curling on the wind and the smell of oil on water. The battle for Midway was over. The silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire that had filled the sky the day before. American sailors stood at the rails, staring at the black slicks drifting past their ships. "That's what victory smells like," someone said quietly. Another answered, "Then God help us if we ever win another one." On the Enterprise, reports arrived by coded bursts: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all lost. Admiral Chester Nimitz read the words twice before folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. Around him, the room buzzed with restrained excitement, but he spoke softly, "Tell Washington, Midway is secure. And tell them we paid in full." The official numbers would come later. Japan, 4 carriers sunk, 248 aircraft destroyed, more than 3,000 men lost. United States, 1 carrier, Yorktown, gone, 307 Americans dead. But numbers meant nothing that morning. The sea was littered with wreckage, fuel drums, torn life vests, and fragments of wood still burning. A small seaplane skimmed across the waves, its pilot reporting faint cries from the debris fields. Some were Japanese, clinging to bits of wreckage. Others were already gone, their bodies turning slowly in the tide. From the deck, an American officer watched in silence. "They're still out there," a sailor said beside him. The officer nodded. "So are we." Far to the west, in the shattered corridors of the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the telegrams one by one. He read them in silence, eyes moving slowly over the page. "4 carriers lost," he repeated. The officers around him waited for orders, but none came. At last, he said, "Withdraw all forces. The tide of war has turned." That night, the Imperial Naval Staff met in Tokyo. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and disbelief. One admiral slammed his fist on the table, "Impossible. 4 carriers cannot be lost in a single day." Another whispered, "If it is true, the empire has no future." No one dared look at the emperor's portrait on the wall. Yamamoto dictated a short message to his fleet commanders. "We will rebuild. We will avenge our comrades. The spirit of Japan remains unbroken." But even he knew it was a lie. He had planned the war on the belief that Japan had 6 months of freedom to strike before America recovered. Midway came at the end of those 6 months. The clock had run out. On June 6, a Japanese destroyer found Hiryu still smoldering, her flag half submerged, her hull glowing faintly in the morning sun. A boarding party recovered the logbooks and lowered the flag with a final salute. The destroyer fired 2 torpedoes to finish her. The explosion rolled across the water like distant thunder. The sea swallowed her whole. Back near Midway, American search crews retrieved the wounded from the sea. One sailor, his face wrapped in bandages, asked weakly, "Did we win?" The corpsman looked at him, unsure how to answer. "Yeah," he said finally. "We won." But his voice didn't sound like victory. By the evening of June 6, the ocean was quiet again. The waves erased the last traces of the battle. Birds returned to circle above the black patches where ships had burned. Midway itself, little more than sand and coral, stood intact, its runways scorched but alive. At Pearl Harbor, word spread slowly. Radios in Honolulu crackled, "Decisive victory at Midway, enemy losses catastrophic." Civilians cheered. Flags appeared in windows. But for the men who had fought, there was no cheering, only exhaustion. Lieutenant Dick Best, who had led the dive that destroyed Akagi, sat on the deck of the Enterprise that evening, his flight suit still streaked with oil. "We were lucky," he said. "That's all. Just lucky." Another pilot replied, "Luck doesn't last forever." The truth was harder to measure than tonnage or ships sunk. Midway was not just a victory, it was the end of Japanese expansion, the moment when the war turned and began to crawl back toward Tokyo. But to the men who lived through it, it felt like a beginning of something darker. The Pacific was wide, and every island between them and Japan would have to be taken the hard way. In Tokyo, Yamamoto stood on the deck of the Yamato, watching the sun sink into the sea. "The gods have left us," he murmured. His aide said, "We will strike again, Admiral." Yamamoto did not answer. He only watched the horizon, where the light faded into gray. Back in Pearl Harbor, Nimitz wrote in his journal that night. "Today the ocean changed sides." He closed the book and blew out his lamp. Outside, the harbor was calm, but the smell of oil and salt still lingered, the scent of war that no wind could yet wash away. Midway was over. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was only the pause before the long, brutal march west. The morning after the battle, the Pacific lay quiet, as if exhausted. Smoke drifted in long, lazy lines across the water, and the air carried the bitter stench of oil, salt, and burnt metal. Waves rocked pieces of wreckage, shattered wings, charred life rafts, a sailor's helmet turning slowly in the tide. From the deck of the USS Enterprise, men looked out at the floating debris field. No one spoke for a long time. "We can't even tell who won," one sailor finally said. "All I know is, they're not coming back." Rescue boats combed the area, moving slowly through the slick of oil and ash. They found Americans clinging to bits of wreckage, and, sometimes, Japanese sailors too. Some of the Japanese refused to be pulled aboard, waving off the ropes that were thrown to them. One of them bowed before letting the sea take him. A seaman on the rescue craft whispered, "He'd rather drown than be saved by us." The silence that followed was worse than the battle. In the distance, the sun glinted off the blackened sea, turning it into a sheet of molten glass. There were no banners, no music, just the sound of engines idling and the quiet slap of water against steel. At Pearl Harbor, a short message arrived by telegraph that same morning. Midway held. Enemy retreating. That was all. No mention of the 4 carriers lost, no word of the thousands dead. It read like a memo, not a miracle. In the operations room, an officer read it aloud inside. "That's it? After all this?" Admiral Nimitz, standing beside him, said quietly, "Those few words mean the ocean is ours again." But on the decks of the returning ships, the men didn't feel victorious. A pilot named Tom Merritt wrote in his diary, "I never saw the enemy's faces. Only fire. Then smoke. Then nothing. I think I killed people I never even knew existed." He stopped writing there. The ink had run from seawater. By June 6, the rescue operations ended. The sea was too wide, the wreckage too scattered. Survivors said that the ocean still burned at night, faint orange flickers far off where the oil still floated and smoldered. One sailor wrote home. "The water glows at night, like it remembers what happened." At Midway itself, the island was silent except for the hum of repair crews fixing bombed runways. Dead seabirds littered the sand. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air long after the shooting stopped. Men carried their wounded comrades to makeshift tents while the chaplains whispered prayers over covered shapes lying side by side, American and Japanese alike. "After Pearl Harbor, we wanted revenge," said a Marine sergeant as he watched the sea. But when it came, it didn't feel like revenge. Just quiet. Across the ocean, Japanese survivors drifted for days. A few were pulled from the water by American patrols. Most refused help. The ones who accepted it sat in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The shame of survival weighed more than the sea itself. Aboard one destroyer, a rescued Japanese gunner looked at an American sailor and said softly in broken English, "You win. But you lose too." The sailor didn't reply. By June 7, the ocean had taken back its calm, as though the battle had never happened. Only the oil stains and drifting wreckage betrayed what lay beneath. Sharks followed the slicks, and gulls circled above, their cries sharp in the still air. That evening, a heavy rain came down over the Pacific. It fell on the twisted metal, on the wounded, on the graves hastily dug into the sand. The water turned black with fuel and ash, and yet it seemed to wash nothing clean. At dusk, a young ensign on the Enterprise leaned against the rail and whispered to himself, "The sea doesn't care who wins." He watched as the last fires dimmed, swallowed by the waves. In the command center at Pearl Harbor, radio operators logged the final transmissions. The voice of a patrol pilot came through the static, "No enemy ships sighted. Area secure." Then, silence. The report reached Washington that night. One line summarized the cost. Midway secure. Estimated enemy losses, severe. It sounded sterile, efficient. But behind those words were 3,000 Japanese sailors gone, 300 Americans dead, and an ocean filled with ghosts. A war correspondent later wrote, "The Pacific was the victor's graveyard. Everyone who fought there left something behind." When the stars came out over the empty sea, they reflected faintly in the slicks of oil and gasoline. The sky and the water looked the same, dark, endless, and silent. In Tokyo, no one yet knew what had truly happened. Reports had not arrived, and the Empire still waited for news of triumph. But out here, beneath the starlit water, the truth was already written in steel and ash. The Empire was sinking. It just hadn't been told yet. In Tokyo, the sound of typewriters had replaced the sound of gunfire. The war room of the Imperial Navy was dim and airless, its walls lined with maps that no longer matched reality. Officers sat stiffly at their desks, writing numbers that meant nothing, operational losses, minimal. Enemy repelled near Midway. No one spoke the truth aloud. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood by the window, his uniform immaculate, his face pale. The telegrams lay on his desk, still unopened, their edges smudged with sweat. He didn't need to read them. He already knew. 4 carriers gone. Thousands of sailors dead. The core of Japan's fleet, destroyed. A junior officer entered, bowed, and said softly, "Sir, the press requests a statement." Yamamoto turned, his voice calm but empty. "Tell them the engagement near Midway was minor. Losses, insignificant." When the officer left, Yamamoto sat alone for a long time. He thought of December 7, 1941, of the cheers that had followed Pearl Harbor. Then he thought of the men burning in the Pacific 3 days ago. "We won Pearl Harbor in 6 hours, he murmured. "And we lost the Pacific in 5 minutes. Outside, Tokyo still glittered as if the Empire stood untouched. In tea houses, people whispered rumors of victory. The newspapers carried headlines about a small engagement in the Midway area. Mothers wrote letters to sons on distant ships, unaware those ships no longer existed. At the Imperial Palace, the Emperor had not been told the truth. A carefully worded summary was placed on his desk. "Minor setback during operations east of Midway. Our forces remain in control." He read it, nodded once, and said, "Continue the advance." No one corrected him. No one dared. In the Naval Ministry, behind closed doors, Yamamoto faced his senior staff. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and shame. "We cannot fight like before," said Vice Admiral Ugaki, breaking the silence. "The Americans will rebuild faster than we can launch a single carrier." Another officer answered bitterly, "Then we die faster. That is how we will fight." Yamamoto listened without emotion. He knew this was the beginning of something darker, a war not for victory, but for pride. He looked down at the map of the Pacific, the long arc of islands stretching toward Japan. From now on, he said quietly, every mile we hold will cost us a generation. The words fell like a verdict. In the following days, the government censored all communications about Midway. Families of sailors from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu received vague notices, missing in action. Status unknown. The Tokyo Times printed stories of heroic resistance and minor damage to enemy forces. The truth sank beneath propaganda just as the carriers had sunk beneath the waves. One journalist, writing in secret, described the mood in the city. We are told of victories, yet the air feels heavy. The people bow and smile, but they do not believe. Even the wind through the flags sounds hollow. Meanwhile, the Imperial Navy began shifting its strategy. No longer could it strike boldly across the Pacific. The order went out, defensive operations only. Yamamoto read the directive with a tired hand. From hunters to hunted, he whispered. In the corridors, younger officers whispered a new word, kamikaze. It wasn't official yet, but the idea had already taken root. If they could no longer win through strength, they would win through sacrifice. A culture of beautiful death was growing where strategy had failed. Late one evening, Yamamoto received a private cable from an intelligence officer stationed in Truck Lagoon. It read simply, morale collapsing. Men speak of dying for honor. He folded the message, placed it in his coat, and walked out into the night. Tokyo was quiet. The neon signs along Ginza glowed dimly through the blackout curtains. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang. Yamamoto paused on a bridge overlooking the Sumida River. The water moved slowly, reflecting the faint light of the city. He thought of the men who had drowned in the Pacific, men he had sent to die believing they served a cause greater than themselves. He whispered into the night, "Forgive me." The next morning, in the Imperial Conference, he presented a plan for rebuilding the fleet. He spoke calmly, methodically, as if the dream of victory still lived. But inside, he knew the truth. Japan's fate had already been decided, not by gods or emperors, but by the laws of numbers and steel. When the meeting ended, he remained seated while the others left. An aide asked quietly, "Shall I prepare the communique for the emperor, sir?" Yamamoto nodded. "Yes. Write this, our forces continue to resist with honor." He looked down at the map one last time, where 4 black X's marked the carriers lost at Midway. "Erase them," he said. "There is no reason to remember what cannot return." Outside, rain began to fall, soft and steady. It tapped against the window like the faint echo of gunfire far away. The admiral closed his eyes and listened. The empire still stood. But the silence beneath its pride was already the sound of the ocean rising. Years later, when the ocean had forgotten the sound of guns, the men who survived Midway still remembered the smell. Burnt oil. Wet canvas. Salt on their lips. It never left them. They spoke in short sentences, like men still careful not to wake ghosts. "I didn't think I'd survive," said one pilot. "We just did our job," said another. And then, after a long silence, an older sailor added, "We saw an empire fall into the sea." History would call Midway a turning point, but to those who lived it, it was simply the day the world tilted. Before it, Japan ruled the Pacific like a god. After it, America began to write its own scripture in steel. In 1942, victory had seemed impossible. The Pacific was too vast, the enemy too confident, the wounds of Pearl Harbor too fresh. Yet, on a morning that lasted only a few hours, everything reversed. It wasn't power that changed the tide, it was patience, calculation, and courage measured in seconds. At the Naval War College years later, Admiral Chester Nimitz summarized it in one line. "Before Midway, we defended. After Midway, we advanced." That sentence would be printed in textbooks and carved into memorials, but it only hinted at what those words cost. The men who fought there rarely spoke of it again. One of Nimitz's pilots, Dick Best, who had released the bomb that destroyed Akagi, told an interviewer in 1960, "People call it destiny. It wasn't. It was training, exhaustion, and luck arriving at the same second." He coughed softly and added, "We were no heroes. Just men who didn't flinch when it was our turn." The Japanese survivors who lived long enough to tell their stories spoke with the same hollow tone. A mechanic from Hiryu remembered clinging to a floating plank as his ship exploded behind him. "We thought we were fighting for eternity," he said. But eternity lasted until the fuel burned. Midway was not just a battle. It was the moment when modern war revealed itself, when intelligence outweighed instinct, when the mind became deadlier than the sword. The Americans had not won through sheer might, but through invisible preparation, codes cracked in dark rooms, calculations made by tired men staring at paper maps. Victory had been born long before the first bomb fell. In museums decades later, visitors would stand before models of the carriers and read plaques about strategy, numbers, and tonnage. None of it captured the sound, the metallic shriek of a burning deck, the hiss of steam when the sea swallowed fire, the silence that came after. For the Japanese people, Midway became a story of shame hidden behind silence. Textbooks barely mentioned it. The Emperor's radio address in 1945 never spoke its name. But every admiral knew, Midway was the hinge that broke the Empire's back. Without it, there would have been no Guadalcanal, no island hopping, no B-29s over Tokyo. The war's end began there, in those 5 minutes when the sky caught fire. For America, it was the first proof that defeat could turn into mastery, that courage and intelligence could outlast fear. The sailors who came home from Midway were welcomed as heroes, yet many avoided parades. A gunner wrote to his wife, "People cheer because we won. I wish they could see what winning looks like." In time, the battle's legacy became larger than the battle itself. Strategists studied it, historians mythologized it, and generations of officers swore by its lessons: never underestimate your enemy, never assume superiority, and never waste 5 minutes. But the truth of Midway remained personal. It lived in the eyes of those who saw the ocean burning and realized that history is not written by nations, but by moments, and by the people who refuse to look away when they arrive. Decades later, an American journalist visited the quiet waters north of Midway Atoll. The sea was calm, the sky cloudless. No trace of wreckage remained. He dropped a small wreath into the water. "For both sides," he whispered. The current carried it away. Beneath that still surface, for Japanese carriers slept, their decks now coral reefs, their flags eaten by time. Standing there, he wrote his final line. "Empires fall not from the blows they take, but from the moments they misjudge." Midway was such a moment. 5 minutes of chaos that shattered centuries of ambition. 5 minutes that redrew the map of the Pacific and the balance of the world. And when it was over, the sea returned to silence, just as it always does, leaving behind men who had seen what gods look like when they drown.